Morning, everybody. I'm a PCA. I'm also a CAPCA chapter president as well for the area of Sacramento, so Woodland chapter. I've been on the board of directors for the California Association of Beekeepers. I've been a president of one of the local chapters for that, as well as a beekeeper for almost 20 years. So I do a little bit of everything. I like to wear different hats. So I have done this type of thing before. So some of you might have seen some parts of it, but we're definitely going to go through and talk about bloom sprays, especially as it pertains to almonds, but in general as well. I always like to start off with a little bit about the bees so that you know why you should care. And why some of the things that we are going to hear later pertain to the bees and the brood, and then go through a couple of label things like that. So next slide. So essential pollination. So honeybees are the main pollinator when it comes to commercial crops because of the way the box works. So we have either one, two, or multiple boxes depending on what we're doing, and they're usually palletized, like you see on the right here. And we'll have 4 pallets, 4 to a pallet there, or 6 to a pallet. And each of those hives can contain as much as 100,000 bees if you put in multiple. But usually in a pollination situation, you get about 40,000 bees in there. So each hive has about 40,000 potential pollinators. That's where you get your workforce. So it's a little bit bigger than what you would get out of, say, a solitary bee. I know we try to get as many of the native bees to also do our pollination and that type of thing. But you'll notice in almonds that February 1st is when we start worrying if we have enough hives and all that type of thing. So February 1st is, winter for the rest of the country. And to expect a native pollinator to do all the work is too much for them to do with the amount of crops we have out here. So next slide. Yeah, here we go. So key honeybee pollinated crops. Almonds #1, and that's because of the way the almond bloom works itself. It's also a high economic crop, so that's one of the ones that utilizes our water the best, dollar per dollar and resource. But it goes more than this slide. It's 1 out of every 3 bites of food you eat has been pollinated by a honeybee or another type of pollinator. So it's really important to the overall national and global agricultural trade. So next slide. And these are some of the impacts that we have as an industry, and why coming to California is the beginning of the year and so impactful for both our bees and the diseases that we have to deal with and pests that we have internally, but also some of the struggles that we have to get out here and why we have fees and all that type of thing. So you can follow some of these tracks. This is a commercial beekeeper. Each color would indicate a different commercial beekeeper. Somebody in Florida will hike all their bees out to California and have them ready, or come in right before that February 1st, February 15th, depending on when the bloom actually ends or starts this year. So others will then take it all the way up to cranberries, all the way up to blueberries up in Maine, and make this circuit around the country. So it's a giant industry that's hidden behind the scenes. Next slide. And honeybee itself. So this is a worker bee. We won't have to go through all this, but if you understand the bee itself, that it's such a great pollinator that it doesn't actually have to be going after moving the pollen. It has electrically static hairs all over its body, including its eyeballs. So it has hair coming out of its eyeballs. And that brand new bee that comes out of a cell, you can see it looks like a puppy dog. It's just covered in hair. And it will groom itself when it comes back to the hive, and that's where you do most of the pollination. Happens with that pollinator row and that type of thing. Happens actually in the hive. So a lot happens more than just at the bloom. And then on that back leg, I don't know if you can see my cursor. No, can't. And the back leg has the, thank you, the pollen basket, as we call it. So those little spindle hairs and this little nook that happens back there, they will actually take and groom themselves into a little ball in their legs, and you'll see it later in another picture. That's where all the pollen is actually held. So there's different roles that the bee does. Some are out looking for water, some are out looking for nectar, and some are out looking for pollen. They also collect resin off trees, and that's where we get some of the coatings on the hive and very antibacterial materials that we have. So next slide. Different classes of bees. So the majority of all the bees in the hive are that top one, that's the worker. The majority of all the bees in the hive are female, which is also the worker, and the queen, which is the next one down. So the worker itself does 95, 99% of all the work in the hive, and that starts with when she emerges, she immediately goes to work as an adult, and they'll start with the easiest materials to deal with, the safest jobs to take care of. So that'll be taking care of the young, cleaning up the hive. Then it progresses more into a more dangerous role. As they get closer to the opening, they become guard bees, and then eventually they're foragers, which is the most dangerous role that you have, is the older bees. So the older you are, the more dangerous job you have. Eventually you venture out and have to deal with materials you come in contact with, spiders, birds, that type of thing. So the next one down is the queen. Queen is much larger, at least much longer than the other workers in the hive, but she could have been a worker. So any of the workers at one point in their young development could have been turned into a queen. And that queen is going to produce like 2,000 eggs a day in the summertime. And that's important because every day, several hundred bees die naturally. That's just their lifespan. It's only 45 days. So if you're looking at why does the queen have to be so important? Why do they have to lay so many eggs? Why is the brood important? Because it's a law of attrition. So it has to overcome the losses from every day. So when we look at, say, maybe a pile of dead bees or a few dead bees, you know, that's the difference between how many are we losing versus how many are they raising. And if there's an issue with our brood, and that comes into contact with, say, pesticides and that type of conference that we have here, that becomes such an issue because that attrition starts to go the wrong way. And the last bee on the bottom there, that's the male. So the male has no real function within this colony, but every spring a ton of drones are made, and you can see its head is almost entirely eyeball, and that's so it can find the queen. And it doesn't mate with the queen from this hive. What it does is fly off and mate with a queen from another colony. So that's where you get that genetic diversity. So interesting fact about bees is that every worker has a mom and a dad, but does not have a grandfather, because a queen can decide if she's going to lay a female or a male. And to lay a male, she just doesn't fertilize the egg as she lays it. So that's an interesting point there. Next slide. So this just gets into the brood part of it. Why it's a situation, because we have a period of time where all bees are, between the time that they lay an egg, they take about 3 days to hatch, and then the worker bee then has to develop as a larva. You'll see it looks like a little grub or a little worm, if you want to call it that, and then eventually gets to the pupate stage, and it spins a cocoon just like you would any other complete metamorphosis insect. And that cocoon, she spins silk, they cap it, and that's when we'll see that later. That's when it will go through a complete metamorphosis, completely liquefy on the inside and reform all of its organs, and then it will come out as an adult. And it's at that point when it's probably the most vulnerable, is right at the larval stage. So that's when we talk about the old way that we used to do pesticide testing and things we had to worry about with our pollinators was, well, how many adults are affected? It's really what they bring back to the hive, and that's this stage that they get affected the most. Also, our varroa mite affects this stage the most. So, next slide. Here you are, the different stages of brood. So those little pieces of rice, they're actually much smaller than rice, but you get the idea. That is the egg. So as the egg, it actually dissolves and it turns into those little tiny grubs you see in there. And those are all growing at different stages. Eventually they get so big feeding on the royal jelly that they're fed, and then later they're fed bee bread type material. And then eventually it's capped over, and that's when you see all those cappings around the edges of this picture. So this is the point where you have to worry about when it comes to, I rented a box of bees as a grower, and I'm getting X amount of bees, but they're going to start dying off by the time they're done with pollination. I need to have a force that's constantly replacing them. So if you have materials that affect the larva, you're going to see this petering off. And also you're going to eventually be detrimental to the beekeeper themselves. And then the opposite is true as well. So you definitely want to balance between the brood and the adults. So next slide. So challenges facing pollinators before we get into the other side of this conversation. The varroa mites, probably 90% of all issues. I know we make a big point on the pesticide. You hear it from every beekeeper. Why don't they just not spray anything? Obviously, I stand in different camps, so I'm very much, let's talk about nutrition, let's talk about pest management, as well as, beekeeping. So I like to keep the idea that this is a two-part system, or we're all part of the same team. If you talk to a commercial beekeeper, or you talk to a commercial grower, and you get them separated, you'll hear that the talks sound very similar. They have the same mindset. They're all out actually farming or ranching, however you want to think about beekeeping. It's very much like an almond grower. So they're in the same camp, but they have different ideas on how to do things, and communication is usually the key here. One of the things that we like to communicate is what we're going through. So the varroa mite, you can see, is on one of the larvae there in the top picture. And that varroa mite is about the size of a basketball if it was hanging off of you, if it was the same size for a human. And it goes through two phases. It's just like other mites, it's a basically a pest that replicates extremely fast. It is exponential in its growth. So as it goes into a cell, one can go in, a single female, and she will lay an egg that becomes a male. They'll mate. And so in other words, one can go in, and as much as 7, I've seen 10 come out of a cell. Those can go back in 5 days. And so that exponential growth is how we get this. It vectors a lot of our diseases that would not be an issue if it wasn't for this mite. Other issues we have are diseases of the comb and that type of thing. This is why we have a lot of the laws affecting bees, is to keep our hives very healthy, make sure all the beekeepers are not spreading diseases like foul brood. So that one on the top, and you can see that gooey extremity coming out of the cell, that's foul brood, and really the only way to take care of it, at least in the United States, is to dig a hole, put your hive in it with the bees, a little bit of gasoline, and light it on fire. That's what the county will tell you to do. It's a disease we don't want. So we're very much into eradication of certain diseases, and other ones we are taking care of on an IPM type. Well, other issues we have is it's California. It doesn't rain for many, many months out of the year. And so that lower picture down there, that's really dearth, as we call it. So if we don't have anywhere to take the bees, that's where we're usually knocking on doors. Hey, can I put some bees over here? It's based on this. We go through so many months without any rainfall. That's not food for the bees also. So if it's not flowering, you're not going to have any feed for the bees. It puts them at a big stress. And then the last picture I only put in there just to tell you there's always a new pest for us, just like there is in citrus, just like there is in almonds. There's always a new pest coming in. And this is one of the ones that we have in the wetter areas of the state, or the wet areas of the country. And it's a nasty one. It's a little hive beetle that lays larvae that gets gross inside the hive. So there's other issues besides pesticides, just to keep that in mind. So we're not only worried about pesticide, but these are the things we can actually control. And the other ones, all we can do is communicate with the grower. So next slide. Best management practices. I have this on here twice to start us off and then end on this too. So Communication with your beekeeper, I'd say, I mean, I could put that on there maybe 10 times. And the beekeeper is the same. We have laws in place now to make it that the beekeeper has to communicate. If you communicate back and forth, you can bypass most of these issues that you might run into, where there's grumbling back and forth or actual issues, real concrete problems with a pesticide spray. If you communicate with the beekeeper what you're going to spray or that you're going to spray, or utilize the Beware system, or contact your county and make sure that communication is there. So rather than just have them pulled in and I don't even know who I bought them from this year, it's best to have the telephone number so you can ask them a question. Is this going to be an issue? So so pesticide drift. So this is pesticide drift. You can see here piles of dead bees in front of the hive. That's a good indication. It's not 100%, but it's a good indication, something they got into. And one thing to keep in mind is that honeybees aren't just pollinating right next to the box. People like to plant flowers right next to the box, and it's sort of humorous because they will pollinate up till 5 miles away from the hive. So the closer to the hive obviously is what they want. They don't have to use so much energy to fly out there. So it's more like 1 to 2 miles, but effectively you've got a 10-mile diameter from a single hive that they could have gotten into something. So the bigger the span of bees, I think there's something really local. Big piles of bees on the outside, that's something that hopefully the hive is still alive inside. It's when you have all the dead bees on the inside of the hive, that's when everything went wrong. So you shouldn't see this many dead bees. This is definitely something they got into, or something that was sprayed near the hive, or maybe on the hive. But this is an indication if you're driving by, ooh, that spray, affected them, or some neighbor did this. So next slide. So drift at the hive. This is where we want to take into mind where the bees are. I mean, we're spraying, we're doing the turn at the end of the row. There's generally going to be hives at the end of the row in February and March, right? Even if you think, oh, I've got an insecticide spray, I don't use them in bloom. Look, so let's think about, are we spraying an herbicide? Are we spraying a fungicide? Those might be fine once they're dry, but as they spray, you've got surfactant in that mix. You've got a bunch of materials. You've got materials that just keep it in suspension. You can kill bees with water. If you spray the bees at the right time, you can kill them with water. You can definitely kill them with soapy water. So if you're actually spraying on the bees, generally you're doing something that isn't good for them. And then the more materials you have in there, now you start to be a problem. So when you're spraying, make sure you don't hit the box or the opening to the box, and try not to spray the bees. Another thing is to keep in mind is the water. So water sources, there might be a puddle. We're in the rainy season now. So as you're spraying the puddles and the maybe even the faucets and that type of thing, there is a portion of those bees getting water and bringing that back to the hive, and that will be fed to all the bees or used for cooling. And it's good to keep that in mind if you're going over a big body of water. Oh, I'm actually adding something that isn't just going to immediately dry up. It's going to be taken back to the hive. That's one of the ways. Next slide. Drift to the hive. So this is the big one, right? So as you can see, there's the pollen balls on the pollen basket for all the bees bringing it back to the hive. That's where you can test pollens that have been in a flower that was sprayed earlier, or have come in contact with something. You can find big loads of everything from a fungicide to even insecticide, and that's where all of a sudden these bees got into something that wasn't sprayed on the hive, and wasn't something that stopped being a problem once it hit the pollen. So there's another way for it to be drift besides just drifting onto the hive itself. So next slide. Pesticide residues in the wax comb. If you think about the wax as a liver, so just like your liver, it's going to filter out material. So any fatty acid that attracts some of these pesticides, we're all aware when we go through the IPM type thing, we're aware of fatty acids, how that's important to fat absorbing chemicals. that's basically what the comb does. It's nice because it makes sure that our honey actually stays nice and pure, because it pulls out the materials and holds it in the wax. But eventually that wax accumulates, and that can come in contact with the bees at a level that starts to become detrimental. And if you test wax in any hive that you've had out in the United States, you're going to find a list you wouldn't believe of everything that's been sprayed in that area over the course of the year almost. But keep in mind that a couple of these, like fluvalinate, Coumaphos, the first two, and then down the list there's amitraz, and those are actually put into the hive. So those are some of our miticides that we use, and we're throwing those into the hive. But everything else, like chlorpyrifos, chlorothalonil, you can go down the list, see pendimethalin and things like that. Those are found in the hive. Those weren't sprayed on the hive. They were found by the bees bringing materials back to the wax, and it pulls it out of there. So it is something, these materials are coming in contact with bees. So next slide, in the home stretch. California Code of Regulations. So this is as it pertains to the grower side. Pesticide toxic to bees was added here in the CCRs to put it on paper, to codify that there is things that the grower now has to think about when it comes to pollinators, things they have to follow by law on the label, and label additions that were added, as we'll see in a few slides here. But notification to beekeepers is the other one. So that doesn't have to be done directly all the time. As you apply something, you have to give your 48-hour notice, that type of thing. To the county has a program in place, and now it's a really good one, that notifies the beekeeper or gives you the telephone number contact for the beekeeper. I know I get calls all the time, hey, we're about to spray, where are you located? Because they won't know exactly. And here's where I'm spraying. Is this going to get your bees, or is this going to be an issue, that type of thing. I get those calls, and most of the time I say, yeah, I'm over here. It's not a problem where you're at or what you're spraying. So communication usually makes it so there isn't an issue. Next slide. So this is the new bee warning that was added to labels. This took a lot of work on many different organizations, including the beekeeper, everybody from the EPA, even CAPCA had a role in making sure that this works out all the way around. So this is the bee warning. This is across the United States, but especially here in California, where we're kind of honeybee central. If you see the bee warning on it, that's a newer pesticide. So that's not per se all pesticides. It's as ones that have either been renewed or a new pesticide through EPA that has to do with pollinators. They'll put this little warning on there. So definitely keep your eye out for this. This is a hazard icon that you need to really look through as to the material you have. Most of the materials you're thinking of when they're toxic to bees are only a portion of the materials that are. There's a lot of what you would consider safe for you that are not safe for bees. It's not only neonicotinoids. In fact, when it comes to neonicotinoids, that got the media coverage, like, that's across the United States, across the world. They look at that, and I don't like it because they focus on one material. And then if we get that banned, we don't have any problems anymore. That's not how that works, and that's why I don't like the bandwagon approach. But definitely keep your eye on this, because there are materials that you're spraying out there that you think are safe, probably aren't, either on the brood or the adult, and we can make sure you still use that material and not have a problem with pollinators and not get in the trouble with both the pollinator and the county. So next slide. So bee warning language. This is I took a snapshot here of part of the label. This is what you'll see on the label. This actually is a neonic. That's why it has so many of these on here. But you won't see this material in almonds, but I wanted to give you an example of what it looks like on some of the newer packaging, that you will see these little material warning signs there, not just this little hidden text. So next slide, I'll show that. So next slide. This is used in almonds, and so on here you don't see any bee warning. You have to find it. So under the environmental hazards, there's a little blurb that says this product is highly toxic to bees exposed to direct treatment or residues. and it goes down that little line there, and I put it off to the side here so you can see it bigger. But that right there lets you know if you put it on blooming crops, or there's weeds that are blooming. February, we've generally got mustards of some sort blooming. If you're spraying it on that, it's the same as if you're spraying it on the crop. So keep that in mind. Even if the almonds aren't blooming, keep in mind when you're spraying and that kind of thing. So next slide. Pest Control Advisor, here's your knight in shining armor. So this is the person that is the licensed decision maker. So this is who takes the recommendation to the grower. This is also the person that has to go through all the paperwork when it comes to what can be used, when it can be used, considering IPM and all that you have to do in the state. So this is the person that isn't the the drug pusher. This is the person that's making sure that you need that and when you need it, and that you're following all the laws. So the PCA is generally the person who's going to need this information, but is also going to take that information to you and tell you what is needed and when. Follow all the laws and that type of thing. So this is who I talk to on a daily basis. This is one of the licenses that I hold as well. So next slide. So dormant sprays. Dormant sprays are generally okay. One thing to take into account, you can get away with a lot of materials that you wouldn't use during bloom during the dormant spray, provided they do something that you actually are targeting the spray to do. The plant has to take something in, or it has to have a need to be used, of course. But dormant sprays you can do during the day per se if the pollinators aren't out. Like I said earlier, if there's not a cover crop or weeds that would be sprayed, then you don't have an issue as much. But take into mind when you have the delivery of the bees and when those bees need to come out when you talk about what you're going to use. So the next thing is for bloom. So next slide. This is what bloom sprays should look like. So bloom sprays should be done at night. One of the nice things that's happened, it took a little bit of time, but we generally have most growers not putting out an insecticide during the bloom, or at least when the bees aren't there. That's part of the best management practices. So bloom sprays done at night, even if it's a fungicide, it'd be much better at night because the bees go back into the hive right about dusk, and then they don't come out until the first light. So it's better to do it at night than it is early in the morning, because you probably won't make that timing before the sun comes up. But if you're doing a fungicide, even if you're doing a lot of materials that you're spraying the actual bloom, take into account the label. Always follow the label, and they should have some sort of language on this. But if you're thinking about pollinators besides the label, try to think, will it dry on the material? Is this material going to have a residue for several days? Those kind of things. But generally, this is the best way to do it. If you can get through the whole orchard at night, do it that way. So bloom sprays at night has become a common practice through all the orchards and a lot of crops too. So next slide. Apiary site registration. This is on the beekeeper side. They do have to register. They've always had to register. It's been a long-standing thing, but now we have more teeth to legislation that they have to register. So as beekeepers come in, they generally have a holding yard somewhere, and then they put the bees together, they truck them out, and then they'll start setting them at the side of your orchard or in the orchard, depending on how you want them to do it. So as they bring them in, they are supposed to register with each county that they're in. So if I'm in Sacramento County, which my home is technically in, I have to register if I have hives in the back. If I take them down to Stockton or I take them to Fresno, I have to register with that county that I've moved them. It used to be more of a pain because trying to get back to the county in person and fill that stuff out was difficult. Now you can do it online. So there's less reason why beekeepers shouldn't be registering. But even if they're from out of state, they're supposed to register. That lets you know as you're putting together a spray that might be an issue, and you put it in, you have to find out, is there any hives near me? They won't tell you exactly where they are. They'll tell you where they are in a diameter to you, or a radius to you. And And that way, you know, okay, I have to take this into account. Generally, they'll give you the contact information if you want to contact the beekeeper and find out, is this going to be an issue? So next slide. So this is the new laws. So these are in effect. Back in 2020, these became the law. There are now administrative civil penalties, and it can be quite a bit for the beekeeper. So they now have to, and they can actually, the county before had the law, but they couldn't really do anything about it, you know? So it's like a jaywalking without a jaywalking ticket. So now they have the ability to cite any of the beekeepers that don't, as well as the beekeeper has much less ability to bring an issue to, you know, to you that you know they think that you as the grower has done, unless they've registered. So if they brought it in, they didn't register their bees, and there was some sort of spray issue, they have a lot less legs to stand on when they make a complaint. So to be able to make a complaint, you need to register as well. So the fee is only $10, and that's for the whole year. So $10 a year. It's not per hive, it's per year. It's not even per location. So you do it once, and then you have to do it next year. I just did it. And then I can register throughout the states, and all the different counties know that I paid it in Sacramento, so I'm good. Move in and move out is just as important. I want to stress that if there's any beekeepers listening, and then growers too, a lot of the old system didn't take into account moving out. So it's a lot of paperwork and everything to move in, but it's only a phone call to tell them I'm not there anymore. But at the same time, you'll start to see the board they used to have was a board on the wall, and they put pins in it all over this map. Those were supposed to be the hives in the county. And eventually it just looks like a pin board, even though there's no hives in that area. And the move out makes it worthwhile. These systems don't work if the information isn't correct. So moving out and notifying the county that I'm not there anymore is almost as important as letting them know you are there as a beekeeper. So exact location, number of hives, and personal information is kept confidential. That was an issue, obviously, with beekeepers. It's the same thing with growers. You don't want people knowing what you're doing and where you are. Same thing with beekeepers. They get really personal about their information. They don't want anybody knowing where those hives are. There's a lot of theft going on, and these hives are extremely costly. Each hive is worth hundreds, if not thousands, and then we have thousands of them. So you do the math. When they had somebody that they thought, I don't know if it's been confirmed, but they did arrest somebody for stealing $1 million worth of hives just a couple of years ago, right here in California. So that's why we keep this stuff confidential. It's not so much that we're trying to do something in secret. It's trying to keep those things safe. So next slide. Here's the new system, and I was just going to touch on it. Beware. I use it. It's super easy. This is what everyone had been waiting for, especially on the beekeeping side. It's just an app on my phone, really, or it's online, and you just find out where the address is, put a pin, and say how many hives it is. That's it. You're done. Oh, this pin, click it. Now how many hives? 0. I'm done. So it's really easy to use. The first thing you got to do is register. That's the hardest part, and then sending in your check to one of the counties to be, you know, registered for the year. And it works pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. So CalAg permits is one of the ways. There's another way to do it, but it's Beware is the overall program that they've come up with. They've been talking about it for at least 20 years. So next slide. Okay, coming down to the end. So this is the best management practices. I hope we hear about it a couple of times, but communication with your beekeeper is huge. Follow the bee language on the label. The label always is the law. So anything the label says for every pesticide is the law. If you don't do what it says, you're breaking the law, technically. Spray in the evening, that's a key point. I know some of us have orchards that are humongous, and the idea that you can get through the whole orchard in one day is not possible, but spray in the evening is the best thing you can do outside of communication. Avoid drip to the hive, the bees themselves, and water sources will take care of most of those things. You can't avoid drift to the pollen. That's ridiculous, but take into account what you're using, also, obviously. Provide clean water. I didn't talk about it, but provide clean water source away from spray drift is great. If you could do that for where you're not going to spray, you have a water source, whether that's something small, it doesn't have to be huge, or if it's just a water trough with floating plants, that's what I use for my own bees, or something like that. It's amazing how many new things our almond growers are doing for the beekeepers, even planting, materials, planting different, like rapini. I know a grower does rapini so that it blooms right after the end of bloom for almonds, and that's great for that. Schedule sprays, hive delivery and move out dates to minimize pesticide exposure. Provide additional food source before after bloom. I jumped the gun on that. That's the rapini I was talking about, or any type of thing like that. Mustards and that type of thing work great. So next slide. Oh, I'm done. There, I'm done. So thank you for everybody for listening. And if you have any questions, just shoot me an email or give me a call.
Mark, you do have a question? And from our guest, what type of supplemental food can growers provide besides cover crops?
What type of additional food for the bees?
Yes, supplemental food.
Okay, there are sugar syrup. That's what bees will do, or beekeepers will do in the spring. It's usually a sucrose syrup, or we have some use a high fructose corn syrup, but that's basically just the carbohydrates. All bees use a sugar source, and then the pollen itself is more like a protein source, right? So it's a really high protein material. In fact, almonds are one of the highest protein content pollens on the planet. It's top of the list. That and a couple others like clover, right? So clover and almonds are at the very top of the protein content in pollen. And pollen and honey, or pollen and nectar, really, are beans and rice. So they make a complete diet for the bees. We will put in a pollen patty in some crops. Almonds generally doesn't need that. Almonds is all pollen. I mean, it's a big pollen source, great pollen for the bees. What they lack is nectar. So generally anything that involves nectar, or the beekeeper, contact your beekeeper and ask them if they're putting in or need a sugar source of some sort outside of a cover crop, or, planting something in that part of your property that doesn't have trees, or it's that useless piece. What am I going to do with this corner piece on my orchard? That's a good place to just put those, because it's not right next to the hive that they need it. It needs to be within a mile, 2 miles. So if everybody did little patches, you'd have plenty of food.
All right. Well, as you're getting your credit check, I'll start out with really putting into perspective why all of the actions that Mark talked about that help keep almonds productive and bees safe are important to the grower. If you're a grower in the audience, or if you're a PCA or a pesticide applicator who's hired by almond growers. Almond pollination is a significant part of the annual cost of growing almonds. It's over 15% of the annual cost. At this point, you can see the historic rise in pollination fees. This is per hive, not per acre. So you double this on average to get to per acre costs for a grower. The steep rise that we saw in the early 2000s was due to the rapid expansion of almond acreage, demand sort of exceeding supply or putting strains on supply. But you can see that ever since that steep rise, it is consistently in a much lower rate, but consistent increases every year. And that's due in large part to not only still incremental increases in acreage, but also to many of those pests and diseases that beekeepers experience that increase the cost to them of delivering a healthy and strong hive to almond growers. So it's a big part of almond production cost, and so it's important that we try to keep those costs contained by keeping those bees healthy, not only when they're in the orchard, but as Mark talked about, the impacts on brood development, for example. What we do in almonds or what other growers do when bees are moved around the country also impacts the price that almond growers are going to pay the next year. So this looks at that from the beekeeper side. This is an annual survey that is done by a group called Bee Informed Partnership that the Almond Board also supports. They do this annual survey that helps us understand, take a pulse on the health of the nation's honeybee supplies. And you can see here the total annual losses. The dark bars have remained high and are now at about 40% every year. And what that means is that beekeepers then have to reconstitute their hives. They need to buy new queens, they need to provide supplemental food in order to regrow those bees so that we can have strong hives delivered every February to almonds. So that high bee die-off rate translates into higher costs for almond growers because of the higher cost to beekeepers. So as Mark talked about, there's multiple ways that what we do in our orchards can impact bee health. Certainly direct exposure to toxic insecticides is probably the most egregious. An example of that sort of bee die-off that you saw outside the hives where you had thousands of bees on the floor of the orchard outside the hive. In a less dramatic way, pesticides can impact the ability of honeybees to do the job that almond growers are paying for, which is it can cause disorientation to the bees, and that affects their foraging activity and thus their pollination efficiency. And then also, as Mark talked about, we can see delayed or chronic effects that impact brood development of the next generation of bees, which might not have an impact on this year's pollination in the orchard, but will impact that beekeeper's hive health and thus what they have to spend to bring hives back to you next year if you're an almond grower. So all of those impacts on bee health can cost almond growers, and it's in our best interest to make sure to minimize those. For almonds, it's also a really significant impact on our ability to market almonds worldwide. Just this week, a year ago, I will never forget being at the American Beekeeping Federation meeting when The Guardian, a leading newspaper in the UK, published a story that this was the headline, like "Sending Bees to War, the Deadly Truth Behind Your Almond Milk." Obviously, it's based on misinformation. However, you can see the context at which perceptions of pesticide use in almonds is responsible for these large bee health problems across the country, and that affects our ability to market almonds. So whether the grower is not getting their full return on investment for what they pay for those hives, or it affects the overall marketing of almonds, bee health is absolutely top priority in the almond world. So the Almond Board has a great resource, whether you're a grower, a PCA, a pesticide applicator, or a beekeeper. It speaks to all of you. The Honeybee Best Management Practices, which are available on our website, right there, almonds.com. You can download a copy of it. We can mail copies to you. If you'd like a hard copy, feel free to send us an email at fieldoutreach@almondboard.com or type your address in the chat if that's easier for you, and we'd be happy to send you copies. It's very easy to read and very complete and covers many of the points that Mark and I will talk about here. I think Mark said he could say this 10 times, and he got a couple times in there, so I'll get it in a couple times more. Communication is absolutely essential to keeping bees safe while in almond orchards. There are many parties involved here. You have the grower, the PCA, the applicator, the beekeeper, and in some cases the county, well, in all cases the county ag commissioner is involved directly or indirectly. So that is why it is the law for both the pesticide applicator and for the beekeeper to notify where hives are placed and to give that 48-hour advance notice to all beekeepers who have hives within a 1-mile radius of where you're going to apply a product. So communication is essential, and the law. As a PCA, hopefully you're having an explicit discussion with the grower about what you think your pesticide plan will be during bloom. That ensures that either the grower plays his or her role in communicating and make sure that there's good agreement on what's going to be done in that orchard, since they have hired you for your good advice. Mark covered these, the importance of reading pesticide labels, and this new bee advisory box, which unfortunately is not necessarily on all products because it does make it easier to read, is important to keep your eye on. In addition to some of the mitigation measures that Mark and I will talk about, I also would stress that it's important to consider whether you can choose a product with the shortest residual toxicity. So as both of us have talked about, you can have impacts on bee health when you directly contact bees with a pesticide, but also that if you spray, there is a time after that spray, the residual time, when that product can harm bees before it dries or becomes less harmful to bees. So that residual toxicity is an important aspect of the bee advisory box. And when you have choices, particularly on fungicides, when possible, choose the product that is effective but has a shorter residual toxicity time. And for insecticide treatments, which generally should not be needed during bloom, we strongly encourage that you look at integrated pest management alternatives. And the University of California has a great IPM website that you can turn to find what those are. Okay, we had a question in the chat earlier, and I wanted to address this issue of adjuvants, surfactants, spreaders. They go by a number of different names. The Almond Board has funded research along with other organizations that increasingly point to the fact that adjuvants, surfactants, spreaders can harm bees, even if the product you're adding it to in itself doesn't harm bees. So for fungicides, which is probably the only thing you need to be spraying in an orchard during bloom time, make sure you read the label and do not add an adjuvant, surfactant, or spreader unless specifically called for on the label. Adding those is putting more bees at risk. Also, a question around tank mixes. So tank mixes here refers not to adding a spreader or an adjuvant, but rather to mixing an insecticide and a fungicide. And again, this is research funded by the Almond Board, which shows that tank mixing in some cases can make a product more lethal than when it's used in isolation. So particularly looking over here on figure C, this blue bar is an insecticide commonly known as Altacor. And you can see that the higher the bar, the less lethal it is to bees. So Altacor is actually considered not harmful to bees in itself, in isolation. However, when it's combined with the fungicide, commonly known as Tilt, you can see a very significant increase in the toxicity to bees as measured by much lower survival rates of adults emerging in that hive. So this is an example where tank mixing can have a significantly negative impact on bee health, even when the individual chemicals themselves are not considered particularly dangerous for bees. So don't tank mix. In general, insecticides should not be used during bloom time. look for IPM alternatives, and the reality is there's not generally that many insects around that cause problems at that time of year. So we've talked again about that mandatory advance notification. It is mandatory for any pesticides that are labeled toxic to bees, but we certainly recommend it for all applications. It's just safe to be to communicate when there's any doubt, or just to make sure we stay on the safe side. Mark talked about this. The Almond Board, along with CAPCA and a number of other organizations, have funded the development and communication around beeware. So this is an investment we make in the success of your role as a PCA or a pesticide applicator or a beekeeper. Use beeware. It is the simplest way to do it. Used to be everyone called the county ag commissioner, and they had these maps that, these physical maps that Mark described with pins. You certainly can still call the county ag commissioner. That is one of the ways in which you can meet your legal requirement. But beeware is meant to make this process a lot more easy for you, and to make sure you can get information out at any time of the day, whether the county ag commissioner's office is open or not. So really strongly encourage you to become familiar with beeware as a way to make this process successful for everyone. As Mark mentioned, any sprays that you do need to do, particularly for fungal disease control, it's important to apply when the bees are not present. Generally speaking, the bees go back to their hive around sunset, so anytime in the evening is safe. And then they generally start to emerge as early as 2 hours before sunrise, depending on the temperature. So as Mark mentioned, nighttime sprays are far safer than morning. The other reason to do it at night is that it allows the fungicide to dry before the bees begin foraging the next day. Again, you have that residual toxicity aspect associated with pesticides. So you want the material to dry before the bees come out the next day. Mark mentioned water. Just like all animals, bees need water for their livelihoods. So many beekeepers will provide a bucket of clean water next to the hive. They do that because ensuring there's clean water means the bees stay healthy. And it also, by providing it in close proximity, means that bees aren't spending time roaming the landscape trying to find water. So the key thing here is that the grower, the PCA, the beekeeper, the pesticide applicator, it's all important. There's an understanding of who is going to cover or remove the water source when pesticides are applied in the orchard. That ensures that there is a point person who knows they have that responsibility and make sure there's clean water available after the pesticide application, and it's not a guess as to whether somebody did this. If there was spray and no one had removed the bucket, you would have a definite likelihood of exposure to those bees the next day. So again, Mark mentioned when you are applying a fungicide in the orchard, be careful of turning the nozzles off as you come near the hive. You certainly don't want to hit any flying bees, and if you're applying them at night, that should not be a problem. That picture there of those bee die-offs is something we never want to see in an almond orchard, because that does make it into the news. There was an incident about 4 or 5 years ago, I believe, that I still occasionally get questions about in almonds. So want to make sure that we don't have any situations where you see large numbers of dead bees outside the hive. So just a little care taken in knowing where those hives are and making sure you turn the nozzles off as you come to the end of the row where hives might be present. If something does go wrong, you have an obligation to report suspected pesticide-related incidences to the county ag commissioner's office. So whether that's the grower, the PCA, or the pesticide applicator, or the beekeeper, if there are excessive number of dead bees, or the bees are acting erratic, another sign of pesticide exposure, take notes of the particular pesticide that was applied, any environmental conditions that could have caused drift, and any photos of the material. And do not disturb the hive, because the county ag commissioner may come out and inspect that. The last step in the communication is removing of the hive. The recommendation from the University of California is to remove the hives when about 90% of the almond petals have dropped. There's no pollination being made at this point by those flowers, and the bees thus are moving outside the orchard to forage. So when they start moving outside the orchard, it's when they become at higher risk of contact with insecticide-treated crops outside of almonds. So it's in the best interest of the beekeeper and the grower, who will be paying for those bees next year, to make sure the beekeeper, there's an agreement on when the beekeeper will come to remove those hives. It also reduces the risk for the grower, PCA, or pesticide applicators who might need to start getting in the orchard to do other insecticide and other management practices. So it's important to get those bees out on time and make sure that they're safe. The other thing I would add here is we had an incident last year where a grower decided to buy the hives that a beekeeper from Florida had brought for pollination. I think the grower maybe thought he or she would give his hand at being a beekeeper and maybe reduce some costs for next year. Really recommend you think twice, if you're a grower, about purchasing hives that you rented this year, particularly if those hives come from any one of the southern states. You might recall Mark showed a map of how beehives move around the country. Almonds take anywhere from 60 to 80% of the beehives, the commercial beehives available in the United States. So there's lots of beehives that come from the southern states, particularly Florida. And those states may have, excuse me, Africanized honeybees. Africanized honeybees are more aggressive. And in this case last year, where the grower purchased those hives, they were Africanized bees, and that's a particular problem up in the Sacramento Valley region, where that region is actually the headquarters of the queen bee breeding in all of North America. So if there's an introduction of Africanized bees into that area, it could impact queen bee breeding and bring some of that more aggressive genetics into future honeybee populations, which is not in the interest of beekeepers and certainly not in the interest of almond growers either. So it's important not to consider very carefully if you're going to keep those hives around, or whether you should just count on renting them every year. I'd say we've made a lot of progress since introduction of the bee best management practices. So you all are doing a good job, and we hope that will continue. This is data from research funded by the Almond Board that shows that insecticide use during bloom has gone down significantly since we introduced the best management practices. So that's a great proof point of the good work that PCAs, pesticide applicators, and growers are doing together. And through the California Almond Sustainability Program, we know that growers who participate in this are, a vast majority of them are following some of those key practices that we've talked about here. So great examples of the good work that you all are doing, and we hope to see that continue so that almonds remain profitable, growers get the best return on investment for their pollination dollar, and we continue to be able to tell the consumer that they are eating a product that is produced through the natural partnership between almonds and bees. So in addition, there's a few resources I just wanted to make sure that you are aware of. If you want to dive deeper than we've covered here today, the University of Oregon, or Oregon State, produces a great resource on how to reduce bee poisoning from pesticides. Much of that information is also included in the Almond Bee Best Management Practices. As I mentioned, UC IPM has really easy to read. I was just on their website this morning. Resources on bee precautions associated with all chemicals used in agriculture in California, and also provides alternatives if you want to look at IPM practices beyond pesticide sprays. And again, can't mention enough, please let us know if you'd like a hard copy. Feel free to email us or put your address in the chat and we'll mail off a copy. You can also download it from almonds.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miles Dakin to talk about a special opportunity that the Almond Board has put together with Pollinator Partnership that goes beyond just reducing risks and actually starts to get into how to reward you for investing in providing high quality forage for bees in your orchards. Over to you, Miles.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I apologize, there is a lawnmower outside now, of course. So I am from Pollinator Partnership. I'm the Bee Friendly Farming Coordinator. And Bee Friendly Farming is a certification program that we offer similar to organic certification or other certification programs out there that recognizes growers, ranchers, and other farming members who practice best management practices for pollinators, who plant forage, and provides them with a logo use, etc. Can you go to the next slide? So as I mentioned, it's a certification program. This year has been an amazing year for the program. We've certified over 60,000 acres since January of last year. It's been an incredible year, and this has been in huge part because of our partnership with the Almond Board. We've worked extremely closely with Josette and other members of ABC, and we've really expanded. So of the 60,000 acres, about 50,000 of those acres have been in almonds. So it's been a huge year, and it's been really fantastic. So I do just want to shout out for ABC and say thank you so much. So next slide. So bee-friendly farming sort of revolves around 5 main technical criteria that support pollinators. And we're talking about all pollinators here, not just bees and not just honeybees. Just for some context, in California, we have about 1,600 species of native bees with all, thousands of more species of other pollinators, butterflies, moths, etc. So bee-friendly farming really focuses on sort of some fundamentals of how we can provide really beneficial habitat and practice best management practices to support these pollinators. And we're not going to go into this too much, but the main one is offering forage on at least 3% of your land. And this forage can be temporary, can be cover crops, but there needs to be a portion of it that is permanent. So that could be hedgerows, it can be natural brushy areas, woody areas. And those areas provide a habitat for these native pollinators. A lot of them nest in cavities in plants, in stems, or in bare ground, and need that really beneficial habitat to support them. And then, as was mentioned earlier, offering clean water for bees. We understand that it gets difficult during times of drought, but providing a water source that isn't contaminated is extremely important for specifically for colonial pollinators. They can use it in a variety of ways, thermoregulation, etc. And then practicing IPM, and this aligns with best management practices, both from Almond Board as well as UC IPM practices and other published practices that are out there. And then there's an annual certification fee, and every 3 years there's compliance that we audit internally. Next slide. So through this partnership with the Almond board, we've directly integrated with the CASP system. So I'll talk about that in a little bit at the next slide, but it's a great way that you can already do the work that you're doing through CASP and use that in your application for bee-friendly farming. This year has also seen some huge announcements. We have seen Blue Diamond put out an incentive program just recently, which is fantastic. It will reward their growers for becoming bee-friendly farming certified. And then as well as people like Kind and other big companies coming out and saying that this is a huge issue for them and that they want to make these commitments to sourcing from bee-friendly growers. Next slide. So just really quickly, and I think it'll be discussed right after this, but you can actually use your CASP modules, your CASP PDFs in the bee-friendly farming application process. And there's actually a bee-friendly farming report specifically. You can upload that in our application. It will dramatically reduce what you need to fill out. The application goes from maybe being 40 minutes or so to fill out to about 5 minutes or less. So it's a great way that we've worked with CASP directly to just make this process extremely streamlined and extremely quick, and it's quite nice on our side as well. Next slide. So along with becoming bee-friendly farming certified, you do get access to the logo. This logo can be used on your label if you have your own label. If not, you can use it in marketing material. You can use it when you're communicating with processors and handlers, and in communications, Facebook or in your email signatures, etc. There's some examples where actually, not in Almond, but some examples where the logo has even gone a step further, where, for instance, Francis Ford Coppola Winery has a whole wine that revolves around bee conservation and bee-friendly farming specifically. There's also farm signs that we have available. You can post those on your property. You can post those on the certified land to recognize that you are certified, as well as signs and hats and other informational material. Next slide. Oh yeah, so how you can get involved, you can go to beefriendlyfarming.org. You can email me at miles@pollinator.org. Give me a phone call, and we're also on Facebook and Instagram as well. And I think that's it.
Great. So over to you, Eric, to talk about CASP and again, this opportunity to streamline access to the bee-friendly farming certification.
Great. Thank you, Josette, and good morning, everyone. So my name is Eric Harris, and I work at SureHarvest. SureHarvest has worked with the Almond Board since the start of the California Almond Sustainability Program, or CASP, for more than 10 years as a trusted partner in supporting program development, as well as the online platform. So today I'm going to quickly speak to provide a quick introduction to CASP, and then discuss the method for applying to bee-friendly farming certification that Miles just discussed. Next slide. So CASP was established in 2009 with the foundation here. This is like the building blocks of the program shown on the slide. The foundation being around grower outreach and education. That engagement with growers has informed and is supported by the CASP online platform, of which the self-assessments is a key component. But the online platform also includes decision support tools and calculators relevant to almond growing, as well as tools to support regulatory reporting. Through the assessments on the online platform, the Almond Board has been able to generate statistically valid statements about industry level sustainability performance based on anonymized aggregate data from the self-assessments. And I should note that data confidentiality and security is of key concern for us at SureHarvest, and I think also at the Almond board. So the data that's used from the system related to these industry level statistics is only ever in anonymized aggregate format. So the industry level statistics help provide messages that supported through data, like the information that Josette just provided around practices related to bee health in the almond industry. More recently, CASP program has also supported the supply chain initiative, which includes CASP or handlers as part of the platform. So it's important to note that the core elements of the sustainability program shown on the slide here are supported, of course, by multiple other efforts at the Almond board, including research, science, support for new industry innovations, marketing, and communications. Next slide. So the ability to create a CASP online account is easy and pretty much instantaneous. It takes less than 5 minutes. Shown on the screen is the main login page for the CASP website. If you'd like to learn more about the system, you can check out the website directly, and there are also some CASP presentations on the Almond Board YouTube channel. The link is shown on the slide. Next slide, please. So the main features on the online platform include the self-assessments. If you could click, there's a couple animations here. Maybe just click through those. So the self-assessments are the core part of the system. Then that's the orange part there. Then there's tools to support regulatory reporting here, including the irrigation and nitrogen management plan tool. And then decision support tools that's shown in blue, including ability to manage nitrogen and irrigation, and most recently a calculator to support checking your performance against the Almond Orchard 2025 goals. The system is also supported by a variety of reports so that as a user, as a grower, you can see how you're doing in a variety of different ways. Next slide. So the main feature of the online platform and the reason for its original creation was around the self-assessment. The self-assessment includes 9 chapters, or we call them modules, one for each important aspect of managing an almond orchard. The most recent module was related to bee health and pollination. That was created in 2016. Next slide. And here's an example of the questions in the bee health and pollination module on CASP. And they're based on the honeybee best management practices that Josette just referenced, and also the practices that Mark discussed. You'll see the example here, I think question number 3, also my opportunity to reference communication during pollination as being a core element. Next slide. So the benefits of doing a CASP self-assessment include one of the benefits I've already mentioned around providing anonymized aggregate data that supports the entire almond industry to tell the positive story of what's being done. Maybe could you advance? There's a couple animations here, but it also allows the opportunity for a grower to record practices for current year and then assess in future years to check changes over time, recognize the good practices that are already being done, and then provide a reminder about other practices that might be considered for trying out. And then maybe advance an additional benefit relevant to the discussion today is it provides this streamlined approach to apply for bee-friendly farming certification. Next slide. So we've tried to, as Miles had mentioned, we've tried to make this streamlined and as easy as possible to register a farm for bee-friendly farming certification using the CASP online platform. And the steps to do that are listed here. So first would be to complete the bee health and pollination module from the self-assessment, for the current year. Then second would be to check the report for eligibility. So that's based on the responses to the questions would determine performance against those 5 criteria that Miles referenced. And then if you are eligible for certification, then you can download a PDF report and then upload that to the Pollinator Partnership website. I'll just go through those steps in a little bit more detail. Next slide. So the eligibility for bee-friendly farming is displayed as a banner on the CASP homepage, so should be pretty easy to see. In order to determine eligibility, you first need to have responded to the questions in the CASP Bee Health and Pollination module. The example shown on the screen here is for a user that hasn't yet completed that module, so the message is saying, oh, please complete the module to see if you're eligible. Eligibility status is determined from the current assessment year. And if you're already a CASP user and you've done that before, you can use the cloning feature and copy and paste your assessments from the previous year to the current one, and then just quickly focus on any necessary points that you need to update rather than having to redo the whole thing. Next slide. So this slide shows the information that would be retrieved by clicking the banner on the previous page. In this example, the orchard meets all the bee-friendly farming criteria except for bee-friendly farming criterion 1. That relates to having cover crops that are planted to support pollinators on the orchard. So this is a quick report to see how you're doing and if anything needs to be modified in order to be eligible for the certification. Next slide. If orchards are eligible, then application can be done quickly in a few steps. So the first would be to click on the banner. Then next slide. And then that would direct users to a screen which shows the next steps to upload or download your PDF report from the system and then provide that to Pollinator Partnership. So the button that's highlighted there is downloading the PDF report. Next slide. Here's an example of the detailed PDF report that's generated from the CASP platform. And that's what, once you have that, you can upload it to the Pollinator Partnership website. And as Miles had noted, that's a very streamlined process. There's just a couple questions to answer on the Pollinator Partnership website. I think in terms of fees, I saw there's a question about that in the chat box that you can contact either Josette or Miles, I believe, to waive the fees. Normally there's fees associated with certification, but in the case of the application through CASP, those fees are covered by the Almond board. So next slide. And that's it from me. So I'd encourage everybody to log on to the CASP site to check out the bee-friendly farming. To check out the system as a whole, and then you can explore the relatively new functionality around applying for bee-friendly farming certification. This was something that we added to the system just last summer, and so be excited for folks to try it and hopefully go through to get their certification and all the benefits that provides. So thank you. I think there's one more slide. If you have any questions about what I've discussed related to CASP or anything else, feel free to contact me.